prescribing information is really a reliable, data-driven, and comprehensively reviewed tool that's not just for healthcare providers when writing a prescription, but also, for example, is a tool that can be used to generate educational content for healthcare systems as they update formularies and create drug information.
You're listening to the Oncology Nursing Podcast, where ONS Voices talk cancer, a resource from the Oncology Nursing Society. Through conversations with subject matter experts, we examine the important issues in oncology nursing, from new treatments to patient-centered research to advancements in clinical practice. Join us as we hear from nurses in all facets of oncology care, from bench to bedside and everywhere in between. Welcome to the Oncology Nursing Podcast. Hello, and welcome to the Oncology Nursing Podcast. I'm your host, Jaime Weimer, Manager of Oncology Nursing Practice at ONS. And today we're talking with Elizabeth Everhart, Associate Director for Labeling at the Food and Drug Administration in Silver Springs, Maryland, about the drug labeling and package insert process. As a reminder, you can earn free NCPD contact hours after listening to this episode and completing the evaluation we've linked in the episode notes. Welcome, and thanks so much for joining us today, Elizabeth.
Thank you.
To begin, can you give us an overview of the different labeling and package information FDA develops for approved agents? And that's in terms of their content, the application, and the intended audience.
Sure. The prescribing information, which is also called the package insert or the label, includes a highlight section followed by a table of contents and then 17 separate sections that are called the full prescribing information, or the FPI for short. Several of those I will discuss further today. Some products also include patient information called patient package inserts, medication guides, and/or instructions for use.
So how are nurses at the FDA involved in creating those informational resources?
Nurses can be involved in several ways in creating the labeling. They can be members of the FDA multidisciplinary team that reviews the information submitted by the drug maker, also in the review and development of the patient package insert or medication guide, or the instructions for use that are used to help a healthcare practitioner, patients, or family members use the drug safely and accurately.
So I know a lot of health professionals will most often be using this prescribing information to help guide their use of the drug in clinical practice. So what types of information can we find in this resource?
Okay, well, first off, you can find the approved use or the indication for the product. You can find the recommended dosing in the prescribing information. Also, you can find recommendations for modifying the dose when a patient experiences an adverse reaction or when they're taking other drugs that might interact with the agent they've been prescribed. There are also important preparation and administration instructions for healthcare providers to follow when giving the product, among many other things.
Absolutely. And I know one thing that I always reconcile now is that the package insert, technically, yes, is in the package, but many times our pharmacists are the ones that are actually opening the package, and nurses may not have access to the actual folded up, which ends up being like the size of a US map. We don't have access to that version, but they are also available online in PDF form. So that's important to remember. You don't have to hunt down the giant paper. You can find it online as well.
Absolutely. You can find all the prescribing information you can typically find it online.
So now let's move on to the standard sections included in the prescribing information. Can you briefly go over, I know there's 17 sections total, so maybe let's just hit the highlights on those sections that would be the most important for nurses to know of.
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, the prescribing information or the package insert includes a highlights section, which is really just a key summary of information, and in some cases may also include a boxed warning, which FDA may use for an adverse reaction so serious, for example, one that's potentially fatal or disabling, that really must be considered when assessing the benefits and risks of using the drug. And then following the highlights section, there's a table of contents, and then there are the 17 separate sections. Of those, the key sections I'd like to discuss today in a little more detail include Section 1, which is the indications and usage section. And this is what describes the disease or condition for which the product is approved to treat. That's followed by Section 2, which is called the dosage and administration section. This section includes the recommended dosage, any recommended pre-medications, dosage modifications for managing adverse reactions or drug interactions with other medications that might be given concomitantly, or any modifications that may be needed for patients with hepatic or renal impairment. This section, dosage and administration, also includes any recommended monitoring that might be needed for dosage adjustments, as well as medication preparation and administration instructions. Then Section 4 is the contraindications section. It describes situations where the drug really should not be used because the risks outweigh any potential benefits. Section 5 is the warnings and precautions section, and this section includes information about serious adverse reactions associated with the use of the drug, as well as recommendations for how to monitor for them and mitigate these adverse reactions. Section 6 is actually called the adverse reactions section and includes a listing of the adverse reactions for the drug that were observed in the clinical trials, including the most common adverse reactions, serious adverse reactions, and any fatalities, reasons for dose reductions or discontinuations. And for drugs that have been on the market for some time, meaning that they're not newly approved, there's also a section on adverse reactions that have been reported for the drug in the post-marketing setting. Section 7 of the labeling is the drug interactions section. This is where drug-to-drug interactions are described, along with any practical instructions for preventing or managing these interactions. Section 8 is called the use in specific population section, and it may have several subsections, including information related to pregnancy, lactation, contraception, and or fertility. Also, use of the drug in pediatric and geriatric patients, as well as any information for use in patients with renal or hepatic impairment, for example. And then Section 14 is the clinical studies section, and it includes the data from the clinical trials used to support the approval. Section 16 is the how supplied, storage, and handling section. This section describes how the product is supplied and also includes any special instructions for how to store or handle the product. And then finally, Section 17 is the patient counseling information section and includes information for the healthcare provider to use when counseling the patient regarding important risks, dosing instructions, and or management of adverse reactions.
Well, thank you so much for that overview. I think it is, for any package insert that you open, it can be overwhelming, even if it's only a handful of pages up to, I've seen some that are over 100 pages. And I think the way that you've broken it down just to highlight and for nurses to get familiar with what is included in what section. I think every time a nurse looks for a package insert online, or if they have the actual physical copy in front of them, they may not need every section every time. They might be familiar with the drug, but just want a refresher on the administration or the adverse events. And so being familiar, being able to kind of navigate the package insert sort of with intention and knowing kind of which section you're looking for, I think will definitely help nurses be more efficient when they're looking and referencing this document in their care. So how can nurses determine if a drug is potentially hazardous?
By looking primarily in sections 2 and 16 of the prescribing information. If a product is hazardous, in section 2, there will be a statement with a recommendation to follow applicable special handling and disposal procedures. And if needed, there will also be instructions in section 2 for any particular special handling required for the healthcare practitioner who is preparing the product. For products that are hazardous, you'll also find a link to the OSHA hazardous products website for more specifics. That link can be found in the references section 15 of the label. In section 16, which is, again, the how supplied, storage, and handling, there will be instructions for how to handle the product and any concerns for harm from accidental exposure. And if there are those concerns for harm from accidental exposure to the drug, like if capsules need to be opened when a patient can't swallow a capsule, for example, if there are very serious concerns, there may be more information in the warnings and precautions section of the label.
How can nurses apply the information in those sections to the patient care that they provide?
They can use the sections to guide their teaching and instruction to patients, particularly about dosing and any tests that will be done to monitor for adverse reactions and any needed changes in the dosing, like whether they need to hold the medication or take less of it. They can also use the information to describe what the expected and serious adverse reactions for the drug are and how frequently they occurred in clinical trials.
Yeah, I think that's an important point, and I always appreciate that the package insert really does reflect what was experienced or what was observed, documented during the clinical trial phase that led to the approval. And so I think that's just important. I think that give patients that perspective too, is that by participating in clinical trials, this is what develops that base of evidence that helps support the approval. And so that is the information that we start with in terms of what we look for and expect for their experience. But it also leaves the opportunity open that they might have a slightly different experience as well. And it may not be exactly how it's described in the package insert. It may be different, or they may not have any of the side effects or adverse events that are described in that package insert. So I think it's important to always give that perspective, not only as a nurse reading the package insert and trying to understand what to watch for, what to expect, but then also as we translate that information to our patients and their caregivers, of just giving them that perspective. So along those lines, what parts of the prescribing information might be relevant to patients, and how can nurses use that in their patient education regarding a medication?
The prescribing information that I've just described, or the package insert, is really geared towards the healthcare professional, whereas the patient package inserts or medication guides are geared toward to patients. For nurses or other healthcare practitioners, Section 17 can be a useful tool to provide patient education because it generally identifies the most important information for providers to convey to patients for the safe and effective use of a drug. Additionally, the patient package inserts and medication guides that I mentioned are written in patient-friendly language and are good resources for nurses to use to educate patients and their caregivers or family members about really what the product is used for, what its main and most serious side effects are, as well as what to expect in terms of the need for any special tests. Instructions for use are also sometimes used for products that have particularly complicated instructions for dosing or self-administration and are also written in patient-friendly language. These are really good tools for patients and also for nurses to use when talking to patients about these drugs.
Absolutely. And I do think sometimes it's overlooked. I know that many sites, many institutions, whether they have their own series of patient education materials that they develop internally, there are various resources out there. ONS collaborates on our own drug education sheets with NCODA and HOPA and ACCC. But it's important to remember that if your institution doesn't have their own resources that they make, or for some reason there's limitations on what you can use, this comes straight from the FDA. And so this is always a great resource to use for patients. And obviously patients might find it themselves. And so knowing what's listed there, what's described there, so that you can answer questions that patients might have based on the information that's provided there. Always a great place to start. And just knowing if you're going to be reading through the information yourself as a clinician, then that at the very end is usually where those patient education inserts are included. And you could easily print those out and provide those to your patients as well. So I think that is something that maybe not all nurses know about. So I would encourage, any of our listeners, pick a drug that you give often and just find that patient information, read through it, and consider if maybe you'd like to use that as part of your education for your patients as well. Well, Elizabeth, thank you so much for all of the great information that you've shared with us today. I would kind of want to find a package insert now and bring it in front of me and listen to the episode again so that I can kind of walk through the sections as you described them. Again, just to help familiarize what you can find in what section, where it's typically located in that format of information. And it helps make accessing that information and using it in patient care just more efficient. So thank you so much for the information that you've shared. As we get to the end of our episode, we do always like to end with a quick fire session of questions just to help summarize some of the main topics that we've discussed. So the first question would be, what are some common misconceptions about drug labeling?
Well, I think that the sentiment that the drug label is too hard to follow or that you can't find anything in it. If you look at the highlights or the table of contents section of the prescribing information electronically, you'll find hyperlink functions to go straight to the information you're looking for. It's just sort of right there at your fingertips.
Wonderful. That's definitely going to be very helpful and makes it more efficient for sure. What's something about this topic that's not often discussed, but you wish people knew more about?
That the prescribing information is really a reliable, data-driven, and comprehensively reviewed tool that's not just for healthcare providers when writing a prescription, but also, for example, is a tool that can be used to generate educational content for healthcare systems as they update formularies and create drug information.
What additional training or education do oncology nurses need to understand the drug labeling and package insert process?
In the FDA's Public Prescribing Information Resources page, there are several excellent resources for healthcare providers to learn more about specific sections of the label, as well as to find good educational material for patients and their caregivers. There are also several presentations and videos available related to many sections of the label that are excellent resources for oncology nurses.
And I will echo that because we were just doing our own internal review here at ONS, and I kind of fell down the rabbit hole of the FDA website, but there is lots of great information there. I mean, there really is. As you said, there's presentations, there's videos and webinars that help kind of review some of the stuff we've talked about today, but other details as well. So I would highly encourage nurses to not be afraid to check out the FDA's website. Lots of information there. What are some additional resources for patients, nurses, or other providers who want to learn more?
As I just mentioned, that the FDA's public prescribing information research pages has really so many links. There are written guidances for industry, but they have lots of very useful information about all sorts of sections of the label. And there are also many different presentations related to labeling topics. And generally, if you go to the FDA's prescribing information resources page, really there's just a plethora of information that, as you mentioned, you can spend a long time going through and learning a lot about labeling and what goes into labeling and the regulations and guidances.
Absolutely. And, I think for nurses to have that understanding of how drugs move through that approval process, ultimately get approved, and then how the labeling is created as part of that process, all of that is just wonderful context for us to have that we can then influence and inform our patients about, especially if they have questions of like, this is a brand new drug. How did it get approved? How do we know that it's legit? I think some of those questions do arise from our patients. And so having this foundation to be able to speak confidently about this is the process and here's what we know and here's what the study showed. All of that, again, just gives us, I think, a stronger foundation to work with our patients, to educate them. And the information that the links that you've shared here, we'll be sure to include in our episode notes as well. The other thing I would add is that I know recently ONS has created a drug development learning library where we try to house lots of links and resources, I think many of which came from the FDA website, just helping to redirect our members and our audience to some of those wonderful resources. So I would encourage our listeners to check that out as well.
Absolutely.
Elizabeth, thank you again for shedding some light on not only the drug label, but also just how nurses can be involved and work within the FDA and use their nursing excellence and their nursing knowledge to influence this side of care as well. Do you have any final comments to share with our listeners today?
Well, just really want to thank you so much for having me on the show. I love the job that I do, and I hope people have found this useful.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Oncology Nursing Podcast. Tell us about your favorite part in this episode by leaving a review wherever you download your podcast. For more resources and information about oncology nursing, visit us at ons.org or voice.ons.org. The ideas and opinions shared in this episode represent those of the guest and not necessarily ONS.